Okay, well, I guess Mike is waiting to make an exciting entrance. And of course, the panelist that I have not got my introduction for is also the one who will have to introduce himself when he arrives. So I'm a writer and game designer, Robin D. Laws. I'm moderating the panel In the Shadow of the Castle, which is going to cover Gen Con history, basically through the 80s. But the Playboy Club year occurs slightly before the 80s, so we might go back in time a little, because we've got to talk about that. As a moderator, it is crucially important always when you're doing a history panel to do your homework ahead of time. I did my homework 10 years ago when I wrote or compiled the 40 Years of Gen Con book, which is an oral history of Gen Con, and it's still available from Atlas Games. My publisher for that book is here as well. So this enables me to look back in time and crib from my headers in order to guide our illustrious panel through the 80s and their relationship to the history of Gen Con. So without further ado, let's get on to our illustrious panel. The designer of GURPS, Illuminati, Car Wars, and Munchkin, the founder, president, and editor-in-chief of the game company that bears his name, master of the Lego Pirates, Steve Jackson! The founder and publisher of Atlas Games, producer of Gloom, Lunch Money, and Feng Shui 2, retired politician and woodworker supreme, John Nephew. The CEO of Harebrained Schemes, previously founder and CEO of FASA, WizKids, Virtual World Entertainment, creator of Battletech, Shadowrun, and HeroClix, Jordan Weisman. Co-designer of RuneQuest, co-founder of Chaosium, designer of Pendragon, and creator of the World of Glorantha, the Grand Shaman of Gaming, Greg Stafford. So those who attended the previous panel got to see life from inside TSR, but of course TSR were not the only company that was involved with Gen Con, even though they ran it during this period. And they weren't the only company in tabletop gaming. And a number of us, however, on the panel, not me, were at Gen Con before the 80s. Greg, your first Gen Con would have been, roughly?
75, 76.
So that was like a couple of years after role-playing was invented?
Yeah. Before the Playboy Club.
Yeah. Jordan, do you remember?
Yeah, my first one was 73 at Horticultural Hall, which I just tripped into by accident. I was in Lake Geneva and heard a bunch of people yelling and went in. There was a couple hundred people sitting around playing historical miniature games.
And when you were there, did you notice D&D being invented that year on the spot right then?
Yeah,
because
well, you could tell because there was like this halo glow around Gary and Dave as they were sitting at a table. No, I mean this was I'm not sure if Chainmail was even out. I don't remember.
No, that's when they got together and Dave said, "Hey, look at this game where you're down in a dungeon," and that's where it all started.
All I remember is that everybody was playing tables, and then I'm literally just walking through, saying, "Oh my God, I found my people," and then all of a sudden this cry went up, Zulu, Zulu, and everybody left the tables, went to the center, which was an open air center, and watched the movie Zulu.
That was
it. That was my first Gen Con.
And that was an early annual tradition. They did that on several occasions. We actually wanted to put the poster of Zulu in the 40 Years of Gen Con book, and we contacted Paramount and they said, that will cost $10,000 and we don't supply the reference material. So there's no poster of Zulu in the book. So, and Steve, you of course would have also been part of this early wave of the original Titans of tabletop.
Not as early. I came in right after the Playboy Club years. Metagaming's travel budget was small and
That was their secret, wasn't it? Everything was
small.
small.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Playboy
Small
Club,
chit, small budget.
That was a bizarre thing. The Playboy Club one.
Yes.
I was there as a player. It was before I launched my company, but it was culture clash at the maximum.
Yeah, we should let
Right,
John get introduced.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's
So,
okay.
so John, you
I'm
probably
a
come
little
in a
kid.
bit
My
later.
first Gen Con was 1986, where I was a 16-year-old and had a module in Dungeon Number 1, which was debuting at that show that year. So I'm definitely in the 80s and 90s generation. And these guys were they were all palling around together. I remember actually, I think '86 was that an Origins combined one, but I don't know. I remember various things and looking upon Greg Stafford at a distance, and he clearly was part of the scene of the in crowd and the jokes and the humor and everything. And
So let's go back
Yeah.
a bit. As we've mentioned, Gen Con started in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in a horticultural hall. It's called Gen Con after Lake Geneva, and of course it's a wargamer play on words on the Geneva Convention. And then basically the history of adventure gaming is now 50 years of constant upward failure. Everyone always says role-playing has been, we've been dying for 50 years and we just keep getting a bigger way of seeming to be dying. But of course, the real story is 50 years of explosive growth if you go back and look at it. And there have been peaks and valleys. And one of the challenges of Gen Con has always been accommodating the growth of the hobby. So you see it go from the horticultural hall, and okay, well, where are we going to situate it? And so this isn't technically the 80s, but there was one transitional year where they had it in a particular venue, and that was the nearby Playboy Club. Now that, I guess we have to explain that Playboy Clubs were a thing.
Does anybody not know what the Playboy Club is? Was?
Okay, so the magazine Playboy, which was notable for its risque promotion
Pictorial
of
essays.
the sexual revolution. So it was supposed to be hip and swank, and they had this whole line of clubs. And of course, if you're going to have a great match between a venue and gamers in 1979, it would be the Playboy Club. Greg, I think you remember this year.
I do remember some of it. That's this is the panel where we all try to remember what we did, and if we don't remember, we'll make it up. So, but the most amusing thing for me at that club was I don't know if you remember, but the waitresses were buxom young ladies with very skimpy outfits and ears.
And tails. And tails.
And tails, that's right. And
so basically, it's just cosplay.
It was kind of the precursor of fuzzies.
Yeah.
Or furries, I guess,
So you have to imagine a whole venue full of 15-year-old boys with these waitresses coming and leaning over them and asking if they'd like to get a drink or something, and they're all dribbling and drooling and dropping their dice and wondering where they were playing. That was probably the best part. Other than
being one of those teenagers at the time, it was bizarre. It was totally bizarre. I mean, it was and it was not a great. It was very dark. I mean, like nightclubs, it was a dark place, which is not a good invention, just even for RPGs. Trying to look at dice, it was weird. The whole thing was weird.
the alternative was the people playing out at the pool, who were just getting sunburned to a crisp. It was.
That was weird.
Yeah. So I mentioned the dealer's room in those days. One of the best things about the Playboy Club in the early venues was the dealer's room. At least the best thing for me and Steve and everybody, because there were only about 15 of us. Oh, look who's here!
It's Mike Pondsmith.
Thank you for warming my seat.
You going to introduce Mike?
I would introduce Mike if we'd gotten it together to get back in. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Pondsmith, current job title here.
Current job title here, running Art Halstorian Games once again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't escape.
Yeah.
Steve is unwell, so we're going to do it like this.
Dude.
So the once and future king, Mike Pondsmith, the dulcet baritone of gaming.
The dulcet baritone. Actually, this is now the dulcet baritone of gaming.
Radio voice.
Yeah, Steve and I have been thinking of actually doing a slow jam station at some point. It's Steve and Mike, late in the evening. Boom shakalaka.
You know you like it.
So, Mike, we've just been talking about we're supposed to cover the 80s, but in order to cover the 80s, we have to sort of cover a bit of the 70s and lead into that. When would your first Gen Con have been?
Oh, man. My first Gen Con would have been probably 85, 86 maybe.
Okay.
And I showed up as a wide-eyed kid with the original crew, and there was 3 of us, and we're standing around going, this is huge. We'd done Dungeon Cons, things like that. I'm kind of thinking, yeah, this is we're badass. And also it was like, yeah, we're ants at the bottom of an enormous bucket. And then the most amazing part was that we're sitting there, and a couple of the guys from TSR went up and said, hey, we've been playing Teenagers from Outer Space, and we kind of like it, And we're going, they know we are alive. We can die happy now.
So let's get back to 1980, the putative start of this panel. So after the Playboy Club turned out to be weird, the next venue was a traditional venue for a tabletop role-playing and wargaming event, which would be a university campus. And that was it's shortened usually when people talk about it to UW Parkside. That stands for University Wisconsin Parkside. And that was more of a traditional sort of haven where the gamers were off safely by themselves to enjoy the then beginning to burgeon field of tabletop role-playing. And that's when people started first coming in from afar. Jordan, do you want to sort of describe UW Parkside as a venue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mid-sized college campus out in the woods, vaguely near the lake, Lake Michigan. It had a lot of dorms you could stay at, which was good and inexpensive. There was wasn't a lot of hotels, motels and stuff not too far away. Our first year, we started FASA in 1980, which is I think the year they moved.
Yeah.
Right there, and our budget included gas to get to the show, but not a hotel room. And so we slept in the van. We had a booth, but we slept in the van every night. And then a friend, Forrest, who had a company called Martian Miniatures, would let us take a shower in his motel room before the show. So that was our first 2 years. Was sleep.
There's a lot of rustic living accommodations
in
early
the
for the tabletop vendors. Steve, do you remember Parkside? Or no, you came in Milwaukee?
Yes.
Right. Do you remember Parkside as well?
Mostly what I remember about Parkside is the long walk between the venue and the dormitories. And it was pretty hot. I'm from California. It doesn't get as hot as where I lived as it does in the Midwest.
There was one story, I can't remember the year, so I don't know if it was Parkside or if it was Racine, but it was the fight with Patch Press. Do you remember that?
Tell the story.
TSR, as probably covered in the previous session, during this era was going through all sorts of crazy management gyrations and political backfighting that is reminiscent of what's going on in the White House right now, with people being thrown out constantly in different, people coming in. And there were others who were suppliers to TSR who would get caught in these political battles, and one of them was their printer, which at the time was called Patch Press, based not too far away over in Beloit, Illinois, which is right on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. And TSR ordered for what at the time was a huge number of player handbooks and GM handbooks. I think it was like 10 or 20,000 units, big color books, very expensive. And then between when they were ordered and when they were delivered, management changed, and the new management didn't want to support anything that was part of the old administration, so they rejected the books, refused to pay for them. And so the printer was stuck with these books. You can't sell them because you don't own the IP, right? But in the meantime, they're just screwed. And so they waited until the first day of Gen Con, and then they backed a truck up and poured onto the lawn. I think it was Parkside lawn, 20,000 free copies with a sign that said,
Vengeance is mine.
Yeah, it was a beautiful thing.
That's right. We all made extra money that year.
And at this point, the TSR is, despite its, you only have internal machinations when there's money, right? You don't fight when there's nothing to fight over, and that meant
That's why we're all friends.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So at this point, that was sort of the first early punch through of a broad awareness of role-playing, and TSR products started to appear like in retail stores so that people like me as a kid could buy them and discover them. And so TSR started doing crazy, weird, unknown things like marketing. But some of the marketing was also picturesque of its time. Greg or Jordan, do you remember the TSR robot?
No.
No. So in my research, I discovered that this was an example of early boothmanship. They had a little sort of plastic yay-high remote-controlled robot that would interact with people, and I think it had a little script or something. But anyway, it was regarded as legendarily hilarious by everyone who does remember it. They got this remote control, and this is their big marketing ploy for the year. Now, of course, if you look at the hall and look at the incredible high-tech things and the giant displays, the idea that it would be weird and funny that there was a prop used to sell things is a mark of where we've come.
I remember the '80s though. Gen Con became kind of this battle of scale, right? I mean, in reference to the name of the session, right? I mean, TSR literally built a giant castle, right? And it was over years. I mean, it took a couple of years, and it would just keep getting more of it and more of it and bigger, and it literally became like a wall that might get built soon. It became something that walled off their part of the floor from everybody else's.
Mm-hmm. Right, and this is getting us to Milwaukee. So let's
sorry.
shoot for. Let us. Okay. No, you're propelling us forward in time to '84. So the UW Parkside is now too small to house all the people who want to go there. But Gen Con is not yet big enough that its growth can allow them to command the construction of new hotels. So it just has to move to a city with a convention center. So it wants to stay in the Midwest. That's always been the goal of whoever's run Gen Con has always wanted to keep it in the middle of the continent, so it was in driving distance for people. Some people. But the most people statistically can drive to the Midwest. And so the decision was made to move to Milwaukee and to the Mecca Convention Center. Later in the 90s, they refurbed the convention center, but at the beginning it was pretty basic 70s convention center, and that's where the rest of our cast of characters comes in and starts to show up. And let's talk about Milwaukee. Milwaukee has its own distinct charm. Are there any Milwaukeeans here?
I think
we can speak freely.
Yeah.
Hey, I loved Milwaukee.
Yes, a lot of
Milwaukee
people love
rocked.
Milwaukee. What do we all love about Milwaukee? What do you remember about
Besides the
Capital of
safe,
the world.
besides the safe house.
Yeah, the safe house.
the safe
The
house?
safe house.
Off the charts.
Let's. You want to talk about the safe house?
Sure. Okay then. So, how many of you saw Austin Powers? Right. So imagine a bar that is essentially like every '60s spy TV or movie show you'd ever seen. It's sort of obscurely down under a brick building. It has an anonymous door that's marked for universal export. And if you know how to get into it and find the real door, you find yourself in a cubicle and there's a secretary who's waiting for you, and they start asking you passwords. And the secretary gives you strange tasks, like jump up and down on 1 foot while singing something or whatever. So you do all this to get into the safe house, and you walk through the door.
Bookcase
And
slides
you-
open. Yeah.
Yeah, the doors slide open. It's a classic, Max Smart kind of. And you walk in, you find there was a closed circuit camera recording everything you were doing, and the entire bar has been watching you be an idiot. And you go, okay, that blew that date to hell.
Well,
it wasn't really so bad because they had all had to do that to get in themselves, and you could now join the crowd and watch the next people do it.
Yeah.
So it was an initiation.
And the great part was that was just one of kind of the many, many things that became both ritual and rite of passage for new people coming in to Gen Con. At that point, many of the people who'd been, back at Park and so forth, they knew each other, but all of us were these utter noobs. And we would come in and go, what should we do tonight? Well, you should go to the safe house. And we'd be standing there doing the knocking or the hopping or the whatever, and the doors would open. It was like, okay, now you're accepted. You can be as dumb as we are.
Plus, you got a password once you had gone through the
Yes.
initiation, and then you didn't have to do it again.
And then,
Although the fun
inside
part,
this place was just as much fun, though. I mean, they had lots of fake doors, like the doors in the men room was actually just a brick wall. You'd open it and run face into the wall, and they had one wall was a giant puzzle that you could sort out. This stopped working in the early '80s, but there used to be this thing called UFO, U Food Order, and it was a track that would run across the ceiling. So you'd order food, and then this like UFO would fly in and then lower a basket with your food to your table. It was super cool. It stopped working early in the '80s, but
and does everybody remember Hail to the Chief?
yeah, absolutely.
They had an ejection seat, a World War, I guess actually relatively recent ejection seat. And they had a drink that was like the size of a trash can called Hail to the Chief. And the deal was to get people from your crew to get you this drink and sit you down in the chair, and then this entire thing where they would raise the ejection seat out of the floor with all of this noise, thunder, and special effects.
And it was usually a surprise for whoever you'd bought it for.
You had no idea, particularly
Because,
if they were drunk.
Yeah, you'd buy it for them. The crew would come, the waitresses would come and take the person, take him down to the basement. They wouldn't know what was going on. They'd strap him into this chair, and then all of a sudden he's in the middle of the bar with everybody,
With the
playing
music playing and with this humongous drink in his hand, and people going, drink, drink, drink.
Drink. And the drink was the size of, like I said, a trash. The thing was huge. You got to keep the glass, and I kept goldfish in mine for quite a while.
A drunk goldfish.
Drunk goldfish, yes.
And so Milwaukee became a different sort of playground for gamers than UW Parkside, because instead of being a campus in the middle of a forest, it is downtown in a city, all surrounded by restaurants, and there's all sorts of other great places to eat.
German food.
One of the legendary places to eat is Mater's.
Mater's.
Someone want to describe Mater's?
I still remember my first time eating at Mater's. This was, must have been 1989. This was the year that I was with Lion Rampant, and they had just published the second edition of Ars Magica, and we had a very successful booth. And we promptly went and spent all the money that would have bought a fax machine on dinner at Mater's. And so, Mark and Jonathan had more or less invited everybody who had worked in the booth. We were all, college kids, volunteers, and random friends from overseas distribution, whatever. I don't know, there was like 15 of us or something at some huge table. And I remember ordering something, and it was an entire leg of a pig.
Yeah. Mater's
It was seriously this size.
Exactly.
And we were driving back to Minnesota afterwards, and I'd eaten 3 or 4 or 10 pounds of it or something, but there's still a lot left. And I brought it home, but I might not have then decided to eat it after that much driving without refrigeration.
Mater's was like the classic German restaurant dialed up to 20. And you walk into this kind of dark, heavily paneled place, and the best part was they had like all the medieval weaponry in the known universe, plastered all over the walls. There were like full armor suits and things like that. And about the 5th time we did this, at that point I had like a 2.5-year-old that was fascinated with the idea of, Dad, look at all the shiny stuff. And trying to control a 2.5 or 3-year-old charging around trying to get his hands on all these shiny weapons while you have a company dinner going on is an adventure. Did anybody see where Cody? Oh my God! No, somebody get it!
So, and in addition to restaurants, of course, there were hotels. Wow, you could stay at an actual brand name hotel. But one of the hotels in particular had a special, not just Milwaukee flair, but could have perhaps come from let's say H.P. Lovecraft described a hotel, he might have described the Hotel Wisconsin,
That's the one I stayed in my first time.
which was the headquarters of Chaosium. Describe the Hotel Wisconsin.
Broken down is a good start. It had atmospheric cracks in the walls. It was an old place. We loved it.
It was inexpensive.
It was cheap. It was within walking distance. You couldn't get lost even when you're drunk.
It was shabby, but it wasn't filthy.
That's right. Shabby but not filthy.
The
Nicely
cockroaches
said.
had manners.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
And-
we'd rent out a half a dozen rooms every year and camp out there.
Yeah,
It was
you would fill the floor with game masters.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and this was the beginnings of people starting to cosplay at shows. So you would see, a woman in a chainmail bikini walking down the street in Milwaukee. And unlike, I think, the good people of Indianapolis, Milwaukeeans had not been briefed. So the great spirit of commercial welcome you have here was, I think they were a little bit more freaked out by the,
Certainly in the early years.
yeah, in the early
Yeah.
J-Con years.
Although if we go that far back, there were still very few women coming to
Yeah.
Gen Con.
Yes.
So the chainmail bikini would more likely be on a guy.
But he wore it well.
They hadn't been briefed on that either.
This was also a time when it's sort of hard to think back and think that this was a thing, but for a long time there was a lot of bad blood between Gen Con and Origins as the other big convention. They are much closer in size to one another than they are now, although Gen Con was always a tick ahead. But the power struggle between TSR and everybody else, as alluded to in the title of the seminar, was more acute at that time, and I think had some more personal hard feelings in it. Greg, I think you remember the politics behind that a bit.
I remember some of it. I actually remember our corporate hostility between TSR and Chaosium in those days. There were several years where our application was lost and things like this. But hostility might be too harsh a word, but it might also be too gentle a word. There was a lot of arrogance in those days, and that's probably why we're still all friends, is because we were allies. But go ahead.
I think they were a little at war with themselves because, there was a real feeling that anybody who was doing role-playing games was stealing from them.
Right.
At the same time, the convention was to speak to the whole hobby. So that's like, in some respect, they wanted us to be at the convention, but not steal from them. And so even within TSR, there was conflict about how to approach us.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting. Is this culminated at one point? Have we gotten up to the point yet about the great Nerf war outside the castle?
We haven't talked about it yet.
The Nerf, we're going to claim, as invaders of territory, part of the next panel, and claim the early 90s when
Okay.
the Nerf wars began. And so this is when I entered the picture in the early 90s, and the former spirit of genuine hostility, which I think you could say that all gaming comes from fandom. Fandom has traditionally had feuds in it. Fans created a bunch of game companies, so of course those game companies or their organizations entered into very distinctly fan-like feuds. So it was part corporate hostility, but it was also part of basically a flame war that you had with your companies instead of typing at each other on the internet or previously writing letters at each other in fanzines.
And the part that was kind of interesting was the companies would be at death, like, something out of Dune or Game of Thrones, but then as designers, we'd all be hanging out in the bars together.
Yeah, the business people, I guess, and some people here wear both of those hats, so
It could get interesting in
Yeah.
a bar.
Multiple personality disorder.
Exactly,
common in
yeah.
the industry.
Yes.
But finally, at sort of the height of the Milwaukee years, the real hostility turned into we turned it into a game. Guess what? And so Mike described, who wants to describe the TSR castle? John, why don't you describe the vast final edifice that was the TSR castle.
Well, it went through various incarnations. I don't remember exactly when it got to being the full castle. I remember at my first Gen Con, I remember going and getting a whole bunch of D&D product from my editors there. And I recall it being very much a traditional, a bunch of tables around an island and a bunch of products were stacked out and everything, and you could just go through them like you see in a lot of regular booths. But then at some point, they started building a really impressive castle, and then of course the Wizard of the Coast castle was even bigger when that came along. But yeah, it was a thing. They had gray foam, like a movie set.
Huge gray foam walls that were, literally 7 to 10 feet tall, towering over things with crenellations and a whole bit like that. And I remember we would come in occasionally, and like half the time, like somebody who we needed to see was on the other side of the castle, but you couldn't cut through, so you trek all the way around like 4 blocks and see.
Because they built it right in the very
And they put it
center
right in the
of
middle.
hall.
It really did cut down traffic. That's why we were upset about it. Is that it really cut flow in the room, which hurts business and hurts access.
Yeah.
And it was clearly a statement of this is our show.
Yes, we
We're
are
still
the
number
lords
one.
of the manor.
Yes.
And around us are the sharecropping
Peasants.
the villages, the villeins.
But if you take gamers and build a castle in front of them, Mike, what happens?
What happens is one day, Dave Ackerman, who is our production manager, comes and says, "So remember all those foam weapons I told you we were supposed to bring?" And I said, "Yes, we're going to attack the castle." And, I'm going, "Okay, what, Dave? I've had too much to drink already from the safe house night before." And we're handing out weapons. He's getting this all geared up. I don't know how he learned about this. And we hit the floor, and there's like a good 100+ people from every single company we could think of except TSR. And they were holding foam buffers. Talsorian crew all had like foam lightsabers. And we're all going, "Okay, let's get in." We start storming the walls. And at that point, who else was there in the middle of that mess?
I remember at least one of those years being in on it.
Yeah, and it actually went on for a couple of years. It got to, after a while, become a tradition of people getting foam weapons. And the second year, the TSR guys kind of got into it a bit, so we could get some really good melee, silly clashes going on in the middle of the hall, lightsabering our way through, or people were bringing foam axes, and they were bringing, balls to throw. It got to be pretty
And
silly.
this all happened in the hour before.
Yeah, in the
hall
hour just
opened.
before we opened up for you guys.
So the exhibitors are let in an hour before the exhibit hall opens to set up their booths and whatever.
For the next couple of hours, you'll be finding foam darts in
In the weirdest
the middle of
places.
your stock. Who built the catapult? One year, something.
Oh, yeah. Who built that?
I don't remember. That was fun.
But it threw Nerf balls.
And the big soft ones. It was like
Right.
all over the place.
So we're hearing from the audience that it was Mayfair who supplied the catapult.
Mayfair's
That's credible.
And,
That is entirely credible.
So it's,
Mayfair.
And,
But
and,
it did start an overall escalation, not just with foam, but our booths too. Kind of had to raise our awareness factor. I mean, we started building 20-foot tall mechs and shattering skylines that were 60 feet by 30 feet tall, and you kind of it starts a little escalation war of that. Which also,
Yeah, I
Our
actually have a,
spirits were not crushed. We upped our game.
yeah, we went for it. Yeah, actually, I have a shot somewhere around. I've been trying to dig it out when I heard about this. Jordan had built this, what was it, like 30-foot tall mech statue thing that was holographic and huge. And I was passing by the castle one point. At that point, it had like crenellated openings, and you could see Jordan's giant robot on one side. And I realized the shot was perfect. It was like this looming robot coming to get to castle.
But it also inspired a bunch of cool, events. That were, I think that really, we've seen continue to grow. I remember back in the '80s, we had a big story event where there was this big wedding for BattleTech, and so we had. We had mailed, this was before email, so we had mailed all of our players, the wedding invitations, and to come to Gen Con, and the wedding was celebrated, on Saturday at Gen Con, and we actually rolled out sheet cake, wedding cake for 1,000 people at the booth to celebrate this fictional wedding. And there were a lot of people who were doing these kinds of big, immersive events. I mean, Vampire did well, you
Right,
you
but
took that even another
FOSSA
level.
really pioneered that
Yeah.
and really did a great job of, your marketing was a narrative event, and that people got excited about. Later on, there was suspense introduced as to what was going to happen, so big revelations in the storyline would be introduced, and so it's part of the. You made it part of the creative tradition of the show, and a sort of both a LARP essentially with cake.
Wouldn't every LARP be better if it had cake?
Yes.
Related to that, when did the Cthulhu for President campaigns?
Yep.
Keep
Yeah.
anticipating my bullet points, sirs. Tell us about Cthulhu for President.
Well, at the same time, we actually, before the president one, we started the Cthulhu cult meetings at Gen Con. And it just got bigger and bigger, and we'd have crazy stuff going on. But the biggest ones were the Cthulhu for President. When did we start that?
It was pretty early after Milwaukee.
Yeah, it was pretty early, and the theme was why settle for the lesser evil, vote Cthulhu, and we would have people get up and give speeches and so on. You know what, one of the earliest things that I loved was when, at one of the cult meetings, we had a contest to see for Mr. Shiny look-alike. And Mr. Shiny was this NPC, and he was this great big chubby guy with big round glasses and bald head, wearing a white shirt, and nobody wanted to get up and compete. And the prize was $100 worth of Chaosium games. And finally this kid said, I can't stand it, I'll do it, shave my head. My mother's going to kill me, but that's $100 worth of Cthulhu stuff.
This man is committed.
And so we shaved his head, and just before he went up on stage, this guy walked in who looked just like Mr. Trump. Wearing a coat, and he was big and heavy and white shirt and lab coat and big round glasses. You'd think that he had been a model for the picture, and of course he
Super
won.
cosplay before there really was.
It was,
cosplay,
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, but it was actually his natural look. It was not costume.
Even the lab coat.
Oh, that's probably so. Yeah. Okay.
Did you do something for the kid?
Yeah, and the kid was just crushed, and I just told him, what, you're the ballsiest guy in the room. Come by anyway. We'll give you $100 just for that, And he was quite relieved. Yeah. In fact, I met him a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago here.
Now he's bald.
And it's the high point of his memory as well as mine.
So coming to Gen Con as a gamer often turned you into a game professional. And John, that's your experience. You were a teenage TSR writer. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I actually came as a professional to my first Gen Con, and so it's weird because in a lot of respects I've never had a normal Gen Con. I started playing D&D in like 1981, quickly realized I was spending a lot of time making up material and thought I should get paid for this.
An early example of the John Nephew spirit.
So I started submitting articles to Dragon, and they did this thing called the Great Dragon Module Hunt, which I submitted an adventure for. And what they were actually doing was trying to line up enough manuscripts to launch Dungeon Magazine, which they had not announced, but that was apparently their plan for it. So I had I was in about half of the first 10 issues of Dungeon from that. So I had just gotten published in April of 1986. I had an article in Dragon, and then I was going to be in Dungeon number 1, and I was like, I got to go to Gen Con. I'd been reading about it for years, and I persuaded.
And did they know you were 16?
I'm not sure that all of them did. At least some of them did. I'm certain that the editor that helped me get into the safe house that night did not know that.
Was that Tim?
No, Robin Jenkins.
Oh, Robin. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, after we were inside, after I had said we're looking for a safe house and we'd, gone in, he was like, so how old are you anyway? And I'm like, 16.
I remember for a brief time there was Winter Gen Con. And it must have been in the 70s? Or?
There were some regional Gen Cons in the 80s. And there was,
Okay, because this was in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It was run by TSR. And I was in high school and went to that. And my big memory of it, because it was in a small venue, is Dawn Patrol, which is a World War I air combat game, was run at dawn, right? And because in those days you were hardcore about these
Yes.
things.
And,
You did.
and dawn in winter in Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mean like 10 a.m.?
No. You didn't have to see the sun; you just had to know it was up. But we didn't have an alarm clock. We were in this cheap motel room. There was like 6 of us, and so we did the only logical thing is we took shifts. All of us reading all the stuff we had bought at the dealer's floor that day, and then you'd wake the next guy up. You'd get your 4 hours sleep, and that's how we all got to Dawn Patrol that morning.
That is gamer culture in a nutshell. We'll post a watch so we don't have to afford an alarm clock.
Exactly.
And we're also prepared if the orcs come.
That was a good sign. Yeah.
Yeah. So Steve, how did the growth of your company, Steve Jackson Games, follow along the lines of the growth of Gen Con in the 80s? What was that sort of track for you?
Well, that was the period in which we were seeing our first real growth. Those were the Car Wars years, and we had big Car Wars competitions. Some of our first fancy booth dress was for Car Wars. If by fancy booth dress you mean Steve is personally putting glue on a piece of cardboard and in the shape of the letters Car Wars and sprinkling glitter on it.
When I think of you, I associate you with glitter.
Yeah, definitely.
Some people have a giant castle and some people have some red and blue glitter and some glue. Some people have a giant robot and some people have some chicken wire. We did what we could, but yes, the crowds just continued to grow, and sales at Gen Con were very meaningful. Back in that particular day, Gen Con was a huge line item, and you wanted it to be a line item on the black side of the ledger, because there was the possibility of coming and having a good time and meeting your friends and getting ideas and selling so many games because there weren't as many stands. So,
There weren't as many stores in those days
Yeah.
to go out and get them. It was the place to get the games.
yes, and there was a period when a Gen Con launch was a very good idea. Then there was a period where a Gen Con launch was a terrible idea because everybody had started to do it. And, so some people reacted by trying to precede Gen Con, and some companies reacted by pulling back and saying, we won't try and ship anything until after the Gen Con rush. But regardless of how you tried to game it, if you had a new product at Gen Con, if there had been any buzz, you would sell an awful lot. And if it was the kind of thing that people could open up and play right away, or open up and be impressed by, you'd create the buzz right there and sell it. That was the happening place in those years.
And it was cash.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah.
The other thing that was kind of interesting with it was that it just wasn't buzz among the people who were coming into the show, but we're all fans of each other's stuff to some extent. So you would have these points either before the floor opened and definitely as the floor closed down, where you had been walking the floor all day going, God, I just saw something Steve just said was awesome. So we'd all be trading stuff. We called it graft and corruption. We'd all be trading stuff back and forth.
Yes.
And we'd all go back to a room piled high with these things, opening up the packages. And I swear to God, I think we probably brought back more stuff from everybody else than I brought in half the time.
Those were the years of graft.
Graft, yes.
I would walk over to his table and go, "I've got the graft," and we would.
I go, yeah. I was like a major Car Wars fan, so like he owned my soul. But
Still do, man. Still do.
can I borrow it back? I've forgotten what it's like to have one.
Sure.
Yes, Dark Master.
Just email it back to me.
Okay.
And the thing is that was actually, I think, the booth trades were
But
a
I need it
really
back in time for the
important
new
part
editions.
of development in the game industry because, I had limited budgets as a college student, as an early entrepreneur, and so on. But it was being able to go and know somebody at Chaosium to get a current Cthulhu rule book or a Prince Valiant or a Pendragon. I remember I'm certain I did not pay for my copy of Cyberpunk.
Oh no.
But then we wound up getting into a business relationship, licensed adventures for it, because
Exactly.
I just loved what was going on, and there was a lot of buzz about it. We would all take those things home, find out what each other were doing, learn from what each other were doing, cross-pollinate lots of different ideas, and then also tell our friends and gamers and ourselves be vectors of marketing information across company lines. And that's always, in this industry, has been just a tremendous thing, is that collegiality and friendliness amongst us, that we would do all that kind of stuff.
And we would tell each other that this is a marketing thing that we're doing, that for marketing reasons we're handing out our game.
Yes.
The fact
Yes,
was,
and that made it a legitimate tax deductible.
Yeah, exactly.
the fact was
Completely above board
we wanted
to
our
give those
friends and our
games-
peers to see
Yes.
the neat stuff that we
Yep.
had done, and we wanted to see the
Yep,
neat
so it was
stuff
not
they
Yeah,
had.
taxable
there's-
personal use, it was strictly a marketing expense.
Yeah, definitely. And there's nothing, I got to tell you, it's really wonderful when you're like running across your friends at the middle of like a party later on, and someone comes up to you for something you've done, and they're going, yeah, I just saw what you did over here for like Castle, and they say, I'm going to steal that next year. And you're going, I am so proud.
Yeah, I just want to comment on how important, it was so important to have a new release at Gen Con that I know that Chaosium at least would rush things into print, such that the first edition of RuneQuest that ever came out not only misspelled the name of Glorantha inside and on the cover, but also misspelled Chaosium.
And the rush to get things out, in fact, goes to what Gen Con became for the rest of the gaming community. It was important not just for the people who went, but for gamers everywhere, because the news about what the new hot thing was would permeate out from the show itself to retailers and also to gamers themselves. And there was a real spirit, especially toward the later end of the period that we're talking about, where there was a real question of what's the new big X of the show? So what's the big new role-playing game? And if you got the most sales on the floor at Gen Con, that meant you had the game of the year that everybody talked about and that gamers back home felt obligated to check out.
And the news got out slowly by comparison. There wasn't any Twitter.
There's no internet.
Yeah.
A lot of it happened after people traveled home. And the important thing about the Gen Con sales was that they were reaching the opinion leaders. The opinion leaders were the ones who drove back and told the members of their clubs what was cool.
Yep.
And that was what drove sales in the stores over the next month.
Yeah. It
Next
was,
month, it's what got us all our Christmas sales.
Yeah.
Several
got us all
months
set
later.
up.
There was another interesting thing about it that I'm sure other companies did too, which would be that like when I was with Lion Rampant and then also Atlas Games in the early 90s, we would often have whatever inventory was left at the show, and we would try to cut a deal with a distributor who was at the show.
Right. Yeah.
And so we would give them like some extra discount. We'll give you 65 off to take all this stuff because we don't want to have to load it into our van and drive it back for hours and hours.
Yeah.
Jan's already full with all the samples we got.
We got from everybody else.
All the swag we got from the other publishers, you know,
Yeah.
right.
But see, that a lot of times worked out very well because what happened was you managed to prove to the distributor that whatever it was, if everybody was carrying it around
Yeah.
at Gen Con, the distributor went, oh, well, I got to have some of that. So it eventually evolved to the distributors would then wander around at the end of it, hoping to pick up these deals so they could go stock and say, yeah, we have a whole bunch of it now, and that other guy doesn't have it, so order from us.
Yeah, and
It was kind of like, just a quick note, it was basically almost like the beginnings of the same elements that now are in Comic-Con, where you got to show it and you have to be there, and then everyone goes back and says, did you see the new, Marvel or whatever? This would be, did you see the new Battletech? Did you see, the new Cthulhu piece?
But the distributor mantra at the end of the show was, you got anything you don't want to take home?
Yes.
right, yeah.
And then for at least a number of years in the mid-'80s, we had a little FASA tradition at the end of the show, because you had, like I said, we'd gotten a lot of cash, and and so especially we're mid-20s, sitting with $20,000-$30,000 in cash.
Okay,
This is-
did you ever put it on a bed and roll around in it?
Yes, I did.
What we would do.
Naked.
Not that
We're
far.
back to the Playboy Club, aren't we? No, we didn't do that. What we would do is we would divide it up, and we would play poker. Right? Because it's like, when can you put a like $5,000? And of course, at the end, we'd gather it all back up and put it in the bank at the end. But just getting to play poker with $20,000-$30,000 on the table
Exactly.
was its own fantasy fulfillment.
Never Monopoly, just poker.
No.
Well, Monopoly's broken. That would be a sucky game.
Yeah. Rules
But I
lawyer.
remember one time when everybody in my crew had gone home, and I had about $20,000-$30,000, and I was really paranoid about it. And it was Sunday night, and I had to get something to eat, and I was too paranoid to leave it in my room. So I just broke it up in bundles and put it in all my pockets, and I figured I'll just walk down to the lobby and eat there. And so when I was getting on the elevator, there's Brian Ansel, a friend of mine from Games Workshop, and he says, yeah, we're going to go, so let's go out, eat downstairs, that'd be great, and the restaurant was closed. So we said, there's a place across the street, let's go there, the sandwich shop. And we
trust
said,
those
okay,
Brits.
and it was closed. And we said, there's an Italian restaurant over there, let's go there, and it's closed. And they said, well, we
Come
heard
into
of
this
place."
alley.
This is sounding more and more like a Brian story.
It is. But, at one point we're somewhere in back-ass Milwaukee, and it's dark, and they look down the street, and there's a street light in the distance with some guys hanging out from it. And they said, let's go ask those guys if... And I said, you go ask them, I'm going this way. Cash.
You were all joking earlier about how tradesies was a business expense instead of marketing. And even though it may have been done for the spirit of let's get this cool game, in fact, it did have that effect because people are looking to learn what the new stuff is, and if you know that other people in the industry are excited about something, that's the beginning of the word of mouth that we were talking about earlier. But of course, another even more important form of word of mouth of getting your games played is building a community of players. And it's hard to remember in the pre-internet days, we're talking about the 80s, how you built a community of people. Even later, when there was sort of when the internet was beginning to come along, and remember Usenet? Usenet was a thing.
Oh, yeah.
But you would have, if you had a new thing that came out, you would go home and wait for people to talk about the games that they had gotten on Usenet, and then
Toys, not Lego.
10 days later, 3 people would post about it on Usenet, and that was word of mouth. But even before then, before the internet, talk about, Steve, maybe the role of Gen Con in building your community of players that is probably a lot of them still the core of the fandom of your games.
Well, you pretty much nailed it already. You made personal contact with these people at the shows. Crowds were smaller. There was more time to talk with people, and you didn't meet a fan and shake their hand and thank them for liking your stuff and wave them off. you had the time to sit down and talk. You could do sometimes extended demos. And that was where you met people who would stay with you for years on rec games, whatever, the various Usenet groups. We also ran a bulletin board service back in the day. And when we met people who we clicked with, we would encourage them to become a user of the then one-line TNet BBS. But it didn't have very many people, so one line was enough for a while. The face-to-face of Gen Con, of Origins, and a lot back in the day of the World Science Fiction Convention. WorldCon was a place where you could actually expect to sell some games and meet some people, and that was where you got to cross-pollinate with the authors who sometimes were sources of great licensing, and sometimes were just sources of great encouragement when they would say, yeah, I play.
The other thing, that there's certain things that you can't market over an internet or telnet or whatever. For us, for example, I credit doing the live action Castle Falkenstein balls and so forth for helping really launch Castle, because getting people together to actually play in a large mass, doing something interesting, much like the Vampire LARPs and so forth, means that other people see it and go, what the heck is going on there? You walk into a room and there's 100 people all dressed up in Victorian costumes carrying steam watches and things, and they've never seen steampunk. So they look at it and go, I need to find out what that's about. And even if they don't pick it up right then or run back to your booth, they now have that seed in their head that this could be pretty darn cool.
When people see other people dressing up for something, they know that thing is involving, because it's a visible commitment, is the words I'm looking for. And if you see that someone else has made a visible commitment, you're more likely to give it a try.
And I think even without the costume, I remember, what got me to my first Gen Con was hearing people having a great time, right? And that drew me into Horticultural Hall. And I think for us, that's always been the core of community building, right? Is to find people who love your game, who love facilitating a great time for other people, right? And that's a skill. It's a talent to do that, and to identify those people and then encourage them and reward them for doing them not only at the big conventions but in their hometown stores is key for building that community, building that loyal fan of players, group of players.
And it's almost hard to imagine these days with thousands of people coming to Gen Con, how hard it was to find other people in the tribe and coming to Gen Con and saying, wow, everybody here is a geek. That's so great, And, before the nerds won the social war and we were everywhere, that was the only place to go.
Yeah.
And that was that moment you'd be walking down the hall in the later Milwaukee days. You'd be walking outside and you'd see, people in costumes, people carrying bags from the various companies and things like that. Backpacks were totally ubiquitous, people arguing about games. And as it grew, you start realizing we're owning this town. We're coming in, and it's no longer like people saying, what are you freaks doing here?
Whatever we
welcome,
want.
freaks, bring money. Now it's out. But it went through welcome, freaks, bring money, and then it went to finally, this is our town.
Right. And but as part of the whole broader cultural scene, Greg, you make a really good point about how we're now starting to forget just how weird you might have seemed, especially in certain communities in certain parts of the country, because particularly during the Parkside years was when the satanic panic associated with D&D occurred. And it seems kind of like a joke now, but at the time there were people, I was in Biloxi, Mississippi a year ago, and someone was remembering how, our game community got shattered when the one game store got pressured to go out of business because this is the Bible Belt and we were considered to be engaged in satanic activity. So I wonder, Greg and others, if you can speak to what that period was for gaming and and how that related to Gen Con.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. What was the name of the first guy, the steam tunnels guy?
Yeah.
James Dallas Egbert.
Egbert, yeah. Yeah. It started when a young man disappeared from college campus, and immediately almost immediately, they decided that it was due to D&D, that he had played D&D and was engaged in these satanic activities. They were actually doing some kind of LARP like game in the steam tunnels and the heating tunnels under the campus. But he disappeared, and it was big headlines. It turned out he was 16 years old. He went to college, which is a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
He didn't quite fit in. He was from Texas, and he went to Michigan, and that was a big deal too. A lot of pressure, and it turned out he discovered drugs, and that was a lot of pressure. He discovered he was gay. That was a lot of pressure, and that's why he disappeared. The games were his only social enjoyment that he had, the only saving grace that he had, but nobody paid attention to that part. It became almost a fad among right-wingers. Pat Pulling, her son also and Egbert eventually killed himself. Yeah. But Pat Pulling, her son also killed himself. And she started an organization bothered about Dungeons and Dragons, and went around the country giving lectures on how to police departments, on how to seek out D&D players and
how to detect D&D players and help them.
help them burn their books.
Yes.
Which actually had another interesting effect further on, because by visiting all these police departments, you begin to get this idea among law enforcement that there had to be something wrong, and whoever got engaged in that was obviously up to no good. And Mike Stackpole and I ended up at one point, many years later, this would have been tail end 80s, early 90s, where we ended up being expert witnesses at a murder trial. And a group of gamer guys, military people, were accused of acting out a scenario. In this case, it was kind of a cyberpunk, not even cyberpunk, but that sort of modern thing. And they were accused of trying to act it out in real life, and they'd shot somebody. And so we're down there explaining, no, you can be playing Twilight 2000 and not have to actually shoot people. I'm not saying you're not going to cut your hand off and make a cyber arm, but you can be normal to do this. And what was frightening was the idea that this stuff that Pat Pulling had done over the years had managed to filter into so much law enforcement at that point that we had to turn their heads around and make them think, did this make any sense, guys? Come on, really?
Yeah, the Game
Manufacturers Association.
Game manufacturers, yes.
Game Manufacturers Association formed a special board of people to address this in the media, and it was pretty important. It was not just involved with gaming at the time, but for a while it was the flavor of the month for Satanic Scare.
Yeah, and that led into the same time period then of the music stuff.
That's right.
And,
heavy rock,
Twisted Sister, causing whatever.
There was one side effect that happened as a result of that, was that every kid in America who wanted to rebel bought a copy of D&D.
Yeah. I was going to say it fueled the growth of our industry.
It was an explosion in growth. We used to send Call of Cthulhu to right-wing ministers trying to get some PR too. It never worked. I don't think they could read it or something.
Big words. There were a lot of big words.
A lot of big words in there. But the Egbert thing actually ended well. I had a friend, she used to go to educational conferences for gifted children. And she would take role-playing games and sell them there. And she was at one where it was Egbert's mother was speaking. And she was a little nervous, about a possible conflict. But his mother knew exactly what was going on. And she had taken the insurance money for her son's death and founded an institution to get teachers to pay attention to gifted kids. Don't ignore them because they're smart. And she was on a crusade you know, for this that was the net result of the whole tragedy. She was very pro-game, you know, and she was very upfront. She said that was not the cause. That was the only succor that he had in his miserable life.
And that was, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, that was one of the important things too. I have a degree in background psychology, and at the time what we started seeing was more and more people writing papers and discussing the fact that gaming was actually helping people who would have been marginalized, and that it was encouraging people who needed an outlet that was more intellectual. They weren't going to join a sports team, but they could be involved in local D&D clubs or whatever. And there was a big shift that came along with conventions like Gen Con, that press would show up and they'd say, look at these people having fun. And they're actually kind of clean cut and doing good things. So basically, conventions like Gen Con became emissaries to the outside world as well. We started seeing more and more press showing up and saying positive things instead of look at the weirdos.
Yeah. We survived the storm. We're
Well,
stronger by it.
and we
Still
we
here.
conquered popular media.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing that's so bizarre, right? I mean, you know, the kinds of stories that that you know, own the theaters, own TV, own young adult fiction. I mean, the subject matter of those,
And even
you know,
video games.
Yeah.
and even video games. Yeah, I mean, that subject matter was only in places like our little companies and Gen Con, and you know, a very small amount of fiction at the time, and now it's everywhere, which is both great and makes it hard to make up new stuff.
Yeah, we used to have a saying at one point at Talsorian, which was that nerds made technology, but geeks made culture. And it became true. We'd look at it, we'd go, you know, things that were beyond the pale and weird now. You know, I was working at one point at Microsoft in a much more boring division, flight sim, you know, which is like where people had button-down shirts and khakis. I was the guy in the death metal t-shirt. But the thing was, they were now struggling to learn that sort of stuff because it had become cool to know about Star Wars. It had become cool to know about role-playing games. It had become cool to basically join the geeks instead of the other way around.
And people who, you know, I mean, like all of us, we love the creative expression of this hobby. We love the socialization of this hobby, and so it's only natural that those are people who go into entertainment.
Right.
And as such, you know, you know, every movie studio, every television is, I mean, they're populated by us now, right? I mean, they grew up with that.
I had a really weird experience recently. There's a game that we have in development that is written by a guy who's a screenwriter in Hollywood. And he DM'd me on Twitter because he came across one of my books from the 80s. And he's like, wow, I never thought I'd be, you know, working on a project with somebody. I'm like, you're like making TV shows. You know, but like some guy who's, I don't know how old, he can't be that old. He must be a, you know, millennial or something. But that he would, you know, still have this, be able to have an idle kind of thought of, you know, we who are sleeping in vans and whatnot, and like, you have an agent.
The big new anticipated Steven Spielberg movie that's coming out is based on a novel written by Ernest Cline, who during this period was coming to Gen Con and running a series of Champions campaigns that took on a sort of epic flavor that so sort of galvanized the whole convention that people would go to watch his group run other people through it. And just like the things that you were doing, Jordan, on the commercial level, they were doing on a fan level, and you would hear back in the fanzines of what happened to all of those superhero characters at the big thing. And there's, you know, the list of writers and screenwriters and people in Hollywood who cut their teeth on storytelling at doing role-playing and would have been at Gen Con during this period is pretty long.
It goes on and on. And in all sorts of surprising places. I mean, Trent Reznor is a huge Shadowrun geek. You know, I mean, it's like I would have never expected that listening to his music. But yeah, I mean,
It actually checks out.
yeah.
Yeah.
But, and incredibly well-read and smart guy.
Yeah.
And it goes all, even Spielberg you mentioned. I mean, huge gamer.
Sure.
Robin Williams, huge gamer.
Yeah.
The guy who wrote the screenplay of Arrival, which was Oscar nominated, fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. He wrote 2 cyberpunk adventures that we published in the early '90s. And actually he was referred over because he had submitted them originally to Artel, and Derek was like, well, you didn't want to do an adventure, but you should take this to Atlas to do under the license. And they came to me, and I'm like, wow,
Let's do this. He's good. Yeah.
Yeah, he was amazing. So we did 2 of his scenarios in the early '90s, and then now he's writing Oscar-nominated screenplays. that
George
are
R.R.
huge
Martin.
things.
Yeah, George R. R. Martin.
He was a big
He's a gamer.
Superworld fan.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying like hell to get his scenarios.
If only he would finish them.
Yeah,
huh?
exactly.
I have a collection of television clips that I'm trying to organize and get digitized of when role-playing. The title of the movie I'll probably never make with them is The History of Role-Playing Games as It Was on TV. And it's full of very interesting stuff, My favorite is the one where it looks like a White Wolf commercial, but it was cops. And they pulled a guy over and they said, do you mind if we look in your trunk? And he opened it up and it looks like a White Wolf ad, with vampire and werewolf and all the spread out, and the cop says, do you think you're a vampire? And he says, oh, not really. And at the end of the cop shows and his badge number is 666, But once D&D appeared on The Simpsons and on X-Files, there was no need to keep a collection anymore, or in E.T., it was just treated as a matter of course.
Well, the kids in the Netflix show Stranger Things, which takes place in the 80s, they're in the Midwest somewhere. So maybe in season 2 or 3, they'll go to Gen Con.
That would be
That'd
great.
be cool, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, we all remember the beginning of E.T.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that was playing a video, playing D&D.
Zero charisma, zero
We
charisma.
went to Gen Con, it was the BlizzCon equivalent.
Well, it's even more than that because a lot of the stuff at Gen Con, for example, you could go and get the T-shirts and you could get the accoutrement and so forth that showed you were a gamer, and you couldn't get that in your regular store. Now you go to Think Geek or something, but then you had to go to a convention like Gen Con, and all the best stuff was going to show up there. And then you would go wear it at home, and it kind of was like this marker. Somebody would come by and they'd say like, +2 something or other on your shirt, and they go, oh, you're one of us.
Yeah.
This is cool.
Remember buttons.
And
Remember
buttons.
when
Yeah.
buttons were a big
And
deal.
pins.
Because we could afford buttons.
So we just we have about 15 minutes left, and I guess let's continue to invade the territory of the upcoming panel. The interesting thing for me when I first arrived in the early 90s, which really I think is still part of the same period, what really changes is when I first arrived, everybody in the industry, when they started hanging out at night and they wanted to start complaining about a company, would start complaining about TSR. And so, as a new arrival, you learned all of the gossip and all of the backstories and all of the business stuff. Some of it might have been true. And then a year arrived, and everybody was complaining about White Wolf. And the castle was still the castle, and they were still selling what they were selling, but that's sort of a sign of things beginning to turn in a new chapter being opened. Even though Gen Con wasn't going to move for quite a while, there's sort of 2 Gen Con Milwaukee periods. And so I wonder if people can speak to the feeling of things changing, and TSR no longer, despite their impressive castle being the only top dog.
We have to put Games Workshop in there too.
Yes.
Yeah, Games Workshop actually became more evil,
And
because
they
when you
have
got
very-
Space Marines, you can do that.
It's easy to forget them because they have, not as big a presence at the show. They
Right.
decided to go off and do their own thing.
Yeah, they did for many years, and then they went off and did their own.
Well, that was one of the reasons everybody didn't like them, was because they were standoffish. They were not part of us.
Oh.
They were out to create their own genre and market And they were pretty aggressive about it and pretty hostile towards a lot of us.
Their whole tagline about the Games Workshop hobby. You know,
Right.
what are we, chopped liver?
Yeah, really.
Well, they didn't start that way. I mean, in the beginning years, I mean, they would come to Origins, they come to Gen Con, and for many years we had this totally crazy thing called the America's Pup. Which
the
was this sport that was being game designers. The idea is whoever won last year's America's Pup would make up the sport that would be played next year, and they always had to involve raw eggs. That was the only kind of like byline. But that started with myself and Steve Jackson and Ian.
Livingston.
Yeah, Ian Livingston. We're at it was at Origins in LA, and we were at Knott's Berry Farm, and it was one of those like contests where you throw. I can't remember what the kind of throw a ball, and you're trying to win a stuffed doll. And I won it, and then they said, well, you have to give us a way to win that back. And so then it evolved into this thing where at peak we had 20, 30 companies involved.
And the stuffed doll was a pup.
It was a pup, yeah, it was a little dog. So that's why it became the America's Pup, like the America's Cup sailing race. And it was, so they were very collegial in the beginning and very fun.
Well, the
It was when they
flavor,
changed
flavor changed a lot when Steve and Ian
Yeah.
gave up control.
Right. But they sold out, yeah.
They were heavy duty creatives and quite crazy.
Yeah. But they were also
But in a fun way.
predatory in their own market. I know they did this to you, they did this to me. They'd buy a license for your game to do it in England, and then they would sit on it, and they would release their own version.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Steve and Ian?
Yeah, even Steve.
Wow.
I was doing, because they did that to Car Wars, or was that later?
No, they didn't.
Maybe
they
I'm
didn't
getting my
do
years
that to
wrong.
Car
Maybe that was
Wars.
after Steve and Ian.
I'm thinking you're probably thinking
Okay.
of Brian.
Games,
Yeah, I think you're right.
Games Workshop made 3 attempts to knock off Car Wars, and none of them were any good.
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, I think you're right. Probably right. Probably,
Yeah,
probably
Steve and
close
Ian were
to-
fanboys. I met them at my first convention I ever went to. They were, these English guys hitchhiking around the country looking at games.
And their first Gen Con was super early too. They were like in the early 70s.
Yeah. But
Showing up out of nowhere from the UK to see what the deal was.
And they introduced gaming to England.
I think one of the things about, on the question of White Wolf, there are a couple of odd things about it. One is that White Wolf came out of, White Wolf came out of the fan culture of the 80s and the creative culture of the 80s in terms of I was involved with the people at Lion Rampant, which included Mark Reinhagen, Lisa Stevens, Nicole Lindros, and so forth, who then went and merged with the Wick brothers to form White Wolf, which then did Vampire. And in terms of what went into Vampire, it was very inspired by what they had been doing with Ars Magica, which was a traditionally, it had a lot of innovation, but it was a nerd's game. It still is a nerd's game. It's a fantasy. Our regular people the same kind of folks who loved RuneQuest and D&D and whatnot. And then, and even some of the inspiration of Vampire, I think, I remember Mark the year before they did Vampire. I was at Gen Con and hanging around with him. I was no longer with his company, but he was showing me Nightlife. Which was an idea of you're going to play monsters in the world today. He's like, I have an idea to do a game that's going to be kind of like this, but it's going to be way better. I've got these ideas. It's going to be a whole lot better than this. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever, Mark. But then when Vampire hit, it had so many things that were so compelling, and it suddenly appealed to a whole new group of people, and it brought them in as a wave into our clubhouse.
Yeah, those people were called women.
Some of them were. Yes. So it's actually on that topic. My wife started as a gamer playing Vampire. She became a major D20 editor and now runs Stargate, D20 and stuff like that. But her entry into the game in the early 90s with her college friends and high school friends was through Vampire. And so I think that there was a mix of things, including the all the rest of us having some jealousy at White Wolf having this game that brought in all these new players.
Goths.
Yeah, no, I
New
didn't.
players
Cool.
with Yeah, and they did look different. They had an identity.
Well,
Some
it
of
really-
them had
it tapped
different
into
anatomy than us,
a
and
cultural thing that was
you know,
going on. Like you said, golf
whole new
really
market.
just tapped right onto that.
and so I think that there was both a sense of who the hell are these people in our clubhouse, which fed some of that, and also some envy that they were making money hand over fist with a number of people who line up to buy each World of Darkness game and stuff like that. And then there were also, because White Wolf actually had. Because it was people that had relationships going back years into the industry that were at the core of it, and there was all the inside drama among some of those people who had been college buddies and so forth. And then when acrimonious things happened and they went off to different places, we could all have, smarmy backbiting gossip and spread it far and wide. And so all those dynamics helped make them a great bogeyman for a while.
Your mention of a vampire bringing women, there's an interesting alternate universe called Finland. And in Finland, the first role-playing game to hit was Vampire. So they have had gender parity from the jump. It's just normal.
But I think the larger story is kind of the minority had become a majority.
Yeah.
Right? Up until the mid 80s, TSR was it was 80-20, right? They controlled 80% of the marketplace and the rest of us were 20. And then I think, as we got into the 80s with the growth of the people here and White Wolf and so on, all of a sudden now TSR was not the majority of the industry. They were, all of us collectively had kind of become the majority of the industry.
And I think
that
part
was
of
that was a big shift.
I think part of the problem was that we were no longer selling D&D or the fantasy concept. We had now graduated to where role-playing was actually a thing of its own. It was like before, if there had been one novel and everybody went and read that novel. Now it was, hey, there's the idea that we have novels, and we have many kinds of novels. And so we became a library as opposed to a single outlet.
And GDW with Traveler was a big part of that as well. And they were there early on. There's no question.
Right, and so there was essentially Gen Con reflected one subculture where there was dominated by certain personality types. Obviously dominated by guys, obviously dominated by white guys, and that is a period that now that we can look out at the people in the hall, and they look a lot more like just the regular people on the street. They're reflecting the demographics of America. It's not there 100%, but every year we see it's getting closer and closer as just running games and being someone who finds geek stuff fun is just the default
we
thing.
have to give credit to card games and board games for a lot of that.
Yeah.
Right? Because that really, as that became embraced and really fueled, it really did bring in whole new waves of people and add to the diversity quite a bit.
I have a question about history. What year did Shadowrun have that big Gen Con debut?
Shadowrun was 86 or 87, something like
Was it
that.
that early?
Yeah.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, because 89? Okay,
89.
I'm bad at years. I'm bad, so I'll settle for
Well,
89.
so I remember the phenomenon of the year. 89 makes sense to me because I remember seeing it there, and I remember lines of people and it selling 1,000 copies or something. That there was a huge crowd, and I was with the people that became White Wolf, and I remember the way that you guys had managed the expectations and the interest in advance of the release of Shadowrun, that was something that Mark and so forth were really looking to emulate with what they did to promote in advance for Vampire. That was something that said to them, unlike what we had done, say, with Ars Magica, you can launch a game at Gen Con as this kind of event and with this kind of excitement. And when they did Vampire, they did a glossy, I remember being astonished that they had printed like 10,000 of this glossy booklet flyer, 8.5 by 11 with very pretentious stuff and lots of marbly backgrounds and so forth. And I very remember distinctly that was inspired by what had happened with Shadowrun.
We'd done exactly that thing for
Yep,
Shadowrun.
and they said this is the model by which to use Gen Con to launch a game successfully. And then when that year that Vampire came out, a couple of years later than that, they executed on that and then continued to do it as they released the Storyteller game line.
So I guess it's time to wrap up, and so this period of Gen Con, so each of our panelists, is there sort of a single image that comes to mind or a single moment that you think really crystallizes what this stage in the development of this event and our hobby were for you. Anyone want to jump on?
I mean, to me, it became family, right? And I remember there was a literal point where that was true when Gen Con introduced daycare service, right? And that was driven a lot by my wife, who said, I need help with our kids. But it was a real, I mean, like, that was a deal, right? We were becoming families, and that was both literal and actual. And so, and I think it's always been that, and that's why it's been coming for 40 some odd years.
I think maybe, and this is a trend rather than a single crystalline moment, but realizing someplace along the line that when I fly to Gen Con, the closer I get, the more I'm going to see T-shirts in the airport that say, us. I know where you're going.
For me, I think it would be the first time I took my son, at that point was like, a blob baby. And we walked around the floor before the show had actually begun. And, people were, oh, there he is, and a whole bit like that. And I realized this isn't going to end. We're going to be able to do this as a business for all of us for freaking forever. And before, there had always been this temporary feeling like sooner or later the real world's going to catch up and realize that we've been masquerading as businesses, and suddenly we were real.
And we could tell you were a grown-up because you had a kid.
I had a kid. Gamers had reproduced.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
I think
a
going
lot of
backwards,
times
we can thank Vampire for that. Right?
Yeah. Damn straight. Yeah. No, actually, the running gag was for years that, Jonathan Tweet's kid and my kid were going to, get together and we'd breed a super game designer, but it never happened.
Cody's on his way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the moments was the explosion of creativity, not just with individual authors, but the growing number of companies and the growing number of approaches. Even in role-playing, they were branching out to include all kinds of different things. And that, creativity is what drives the industry. And I recognize that as an important point.
For me, I think even though I had started, writing for D&D, and in a lot of ways, maybe I'd tried some Star Frontiers and a little Traveler with my friends, but I was basically a D&D player when I went to my first Gen Con as a professional. If I hadn't gone to Gen Con, I probably would have just stayed on just D&D because that was the thing I was doing. But going to Gen Con began the process of seeing how much diversity there was in this field and the different kinds of games and role-playing games as well as other types of games. And I brought that home, and that changed. I mean, I remember signing up for a convention game to play Toon, and things like that. And so it was something that exposed me to the breadth of the hobby, and that shaped my career and my life ever since.
Well, I would like to thank Gen Con for providing me the opportunity to do something that we might just as well have done in a lobby of a hotel with fewer microphones and more scotch.
Yes.
So I would like to thank Gen Con for this opportunity to
Something
hang
to
out for
remember
90
for next
minutes.
time.
With
Next time, they should
definitely.
provide the scotch.
with my yes, well, yes. Then you get the even more uncensored version.
Yes.
To spend time with my extended family of colleagues and friends. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming and listening to this. And of course, most of all, thank our panelists, everybody.
Thank you.